June 6, 1944. While thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, a small unit of American soldiers was performing the most dangerous magic trick in history. They were making Hitler see an entire army that didn't exist. In the next 19 minutes, you're going to discover how a group of artists, sound engineers and actors saved D-Day with nothing but inflatable tanks and recorded sound effects. Why the military kept this operation classified for 50 years after the war ended, and the 3 psychological tricks they used that still influence military strategy today. But first, look at this photograph. It shows what appears to be a massive American tank division preparing for battle. Every single vehicle you're seeing is fake. The year is 1943, and the Allied forces are facing an impossible problem. They're planning the largest amphibious invasion in human history, but German intelligence is everywhere. Hitler has 50 divisions scattered across Europe, and if he figures out where the Allies are actually going to strike, D-Day will become a massacre. The Allies need a miracle. They need to make Hitler believe the invasion is coming from somewhere else entirely. They need to create phantom armies so convincing that the Führer will keep his best troops hundreds of miles away from the real battle. And incredibly, they're going to do it with art students, fashion designers, and Hollywood set decorators. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. Here's what makes this so insane. The Ghost Army wasn't made up of elite commandos or experienced intelligence officers. They recruited from art schools. They pulled guys from advertising agencies. They found sound engineers who'd worked on Broadway shows and radio dramas. The military brass looked at the roster and thought they were sending lambs to slaughter. But these men had something the regular army didn't have. They understood illusion. They knew how to manipulate perception. They'd spent their entire careers making people see things that weren't there, and they were about to weaponize that skill against the most powerful military machine on Earth. The man who conceived this operation was a British officer named Dudley Clark. He'd been studying magic and theatrical deception for years, obsessed with the idea that warfare was as much about psychology as firepower. Clark had run smaller deception operations in North Africa, using dummy tanks to fool Rommel's reconnaissance planes. But what he was proposing now was on a completely different scale. He wanted to create entire fake armies, complete with radio chatter, vehicle sounds, and visual props so detailed that German spies on the ground would report them as real. The American military thought he was crazy. They gave him a budget, a handful of men, and basically told him to prove it could work. Clark recruited a core team of 20 officers who understood his vision, and together they started building the most elaborate con in military history. By January 1944, the Ghost Army had grown to 1,100 men divided into 4 specialized units. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the visual deceptions, creating inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that looked real from the air and even from a few hundred feet away. The 3102nd Signal Service Company Special managed the fake radio traffic, broadcasting thousands of bogus messages to create the electronic signature of entire divisions. The Signal Company Special Engineer handled the sonic deceptions, using massive speakers to project the sounds of tank columns, bridge construction, and troop movements. And supporting them all were the combat engineers and administrative staff who kept the operation running. These men were about to enter some of the most dangerous combat zones in Europe, armed with nothing but rubber, paint, and sound recordings, and they were going to change the course of the war. The Ghost Army's equipment was unlike anything the military had ever produced. The inflatable tanks were engineering marvels, designed by engineers at the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Each one weighed only about 100 pounds and could be inflated by 4 men in 15 minutes using portable air compressors. But here's the genius part. They weren't just balloons shaped like tanks. Every detail was meticulously crafted. The treads had texture. The gun barrels had the right diameter and length. The viewing ports and hatches were painted with shadows to create depth. From 500 feet up, which is where German reconnaissance planes typically flew, these inflatable decoys were absolutely indistinguishable from real Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons. But visual deception was only half the equation. The sonic deception unit had created what they called heaters, massive speakers mounted on half-tracks that could project sound up to 15 miles away. They'd recorded actual American military operations for months, capturing every sound a real army makes, the rumble of tank engines starting up, The metallic clank of treads on pavement, the beeping of vehicles backing up, the shouted orders of officers, the thud of equipment being loaded. They had recordings of bridge construction, complete with the sound of hammers on steel, welding torches, and heavy machinery. At night, they'd drive these sound trucks to the edge of German lines and play these recordings at carefully calibrated volumes, creating the auditory signature of an entire armored division preparing to move. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated part of the operation. German intelligence had become experts at radio traffic analysis. They didn't need to break Allied codes to gather intelligence. They just monitored the volume and patterns of radio transmissions. Every real military unit had a distinctive electronic fingerprint based on how often they transmitted, which frequencies they used, and the network structure of their communications. The Ghost Army's radio operators studied these patterns obsessively. They could mimic the radio signature of any Allied division. They'd set up transmitters and spend days broadcasting fake messages, fake supply requests, fake tactical updates, all encrypted in real Allied codes. To German listening posts, it sounded exactly like a real division setting up operations in that area. Now here's where it gets really clever. The Ghost Army never worked alone. They always operated in coordination with real military movements. When a real armored division needed to move from one location to another without the Germans knowing, the Ghost Army would show up at the division's original location and make it look like they never left. They'd inflate the tanks, broadcast the radio traffic, play the sounds, even have soldiers drive around in jeeps wearing the division's insignia. Meanwhile, the real division would move under radio silence to their actual destination. By the time German intelligence figured out what happened, the real tanks were already in position for the next offensive. The Ghost Army was essentially giving Allied commanders the power to teleport entire divisions across the battlefield. The men of the Ghost Army lived a strange double life. During the day, they were soldiers in a combat zone, often within artillery range of German positions. They dug foxholes, pulled guard duty, and faced the same dangers as any frontline unit. But they couldn't carry the heavy weapons that real combat units had, because that would add too much weight and slow down their rapid deployment schedule. They were essentially unarmed artists, pretending to be an armored division. At night, they'd work in complete darkness, inflating tanks, stringing camouflage netting, setting up fake artillery positions, and then, when dawn came, they'd hide in the tree line and watch through binoculars as German reconnaissance planes flew overhead, photographing their handiwork. The psychological pressure was immense. If the Germans figured out the deception, these men would be sitting ducks. But mission after mission, the illusions held. The Ghost Army's first major operation was in February 1944, and it almost got them all killed. They were ordered to simulate the presence of the 2nd Armored Division near the town of WWII in northeastern France, drawing German attention away from the actual Allied build-up further south. The problem was, German artillery had the area ranged perfectly. The Ghost Army soldiers arrived at night, started inflating their dummy tanks in designated positions, and within an hour, German shells started. Landing. Real shells, exploding all around them. The men scattered into whatever cover they could find, leaving half-inflated tanks sitting in open fields. Here's what they learned that night. The Germans weren't shelling them because they'd figured out the deception. The Germans were shelling them because the deception was working too well. German forward observers had spotted what they thought was an American armored division moving into position, and they'd called in artillery to disrupt the deployment. The Ghost Army was being attacked because the enemy believed they were real. It was terrifying validation. As shells exploded around them, the commanding officer, Colonel Harry Reeder, made a decision that defined the unit's culture. They weren't going to run. They were going to finish the job. Between artillery barrages, his men crawled back out and completed the dummy tank setup. By morning, despite the shelling, they had a full fake armored division in place. German reconnaissance confirmed the position, and Hitler's commanders reinforced their defensive lines in that sector, pulling troops away from where the real Allied attack was about to happen. The operation near WWII taught the Ghost Army 3 critical lessons. First, their deceptions had to be absolutely perfect, because German intelligence was good enough to spot inconsistencies. Second, they needed to think like the enemy, understanding what German observers would expect to see and making sure every detail matched those expectations. Third, and most importantly, they had to commit fully to the illusion even under fire. Half measures wouldn't work. If they were going to pretend to be an armored division, they had to act exactly like an armored division would act, including staying in position when the shooting started. This mindset would define every operation they ran for the rest of the war. By spring of 1944, the Ghost Army had refined their techniques through a series of smaller operations across England and France. They developed a playbook of deception tactics. They learned that German reconnaissance planes typically flew at dawn and dusk, so those were the critical times when everything had to look perfect. They discovered that creating fake vehicle tracks in the mud was just as important as the vehicles themselves, because German photo analysts looked for ground disturbance patterns. They figured out how to use real soldiers from other units to create the appearance of increased personnel in an area, borrowing a company of infantry for a day, having them march around in view of German positions, then sending them back to their actual units. Every operation taught them something new about the art of military deception. And then came the big one, D-Day. The Ghost Army was about to play a supporting role in the largest deception operation in military history, Operation Fortitude. The Allies needed Hitler to believe the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, not Normandy. They created an entire phantom army group called FUSAG, the first United States Army group, supposedly commanded by General Patton. The Ghost Army's job was to create the physical evidence that FUSAG existed and was preparing for a massive cross-channel invasion at Calais. They set up dummy landing craft in British ports. They created fake supply depots. They broadcast massive amounts of radio traffic, suggesting troop concentrations in southeastern England. And it worked. On June 6th, when the real invasion hit Normandy, Hitler kept his best panzer divisions at Calais, waiting for the real invasion that was never going to come. The Ghost Army's illusions helped save thousands of Allied lives on the beaches. If you're finding this story as incredible as I did, do me a favor and hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to tell you next is even more insane. The Ghost Army didn't stop at D-Day. They were just getting started. After D-Day, the Ghost Army deployed to France and began the most intense period of operations in their history. Between June 1944 and the end of the war, they would conduct 21 major tactical deceptions, each one more elaborate than the last. They were moving constantly, sometimes setting up a complete fake division in one location, then packing up overnight and creating a different illusion 50 miles away. The pace was exhausting. These men were working 18-hour days, sleeping in foxholes, eating cold rations, all while maintaining the fiction that they were a combat unit rather than a deception unit. Operation Viersen, in March 1945, showcases their capabilities at peak performance. The Allies needed to cross the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before entering the heart of Germany. The plan was for the 9th Army to cross at the town of Rheinberg, but German defenses along the Rhine were formidable. The Ghost Army was tasked with making the Germans believe the crossing would happen 10 miles south, near Viersen. They had 72 hours to sell the deception. What they did in those 3 days was masterful. They set up 600 inflatable vehicles, creating the visual appearance of 2 full divisions preparing for a river crossing. They positioned the sonic deception units to play recordings of bridge construction equipment working around the clock. They broadcast radio traffic, suggesting engineering units were surveying crossing points and stockpiling bridging materials. But here's the brilliant part. They added human details that made the deception irresistible to German intelligence. They had soldiers drive jeeps back and forth on roads near Viersen, creating dust clouds visible from German observation posts. They set up fake supply dumps with real wooden crates, stacked to look like ammunition and equipment. They even had officers drive to nearby towns and loudly ask locals about river depths and current speeds near Viersen, knowing German spies would report these conversations. They created a complete narrative of an impending river crossing, and every piece of evidence supported that narrative. German commanders took the bait. They reinforced their positions around Viersen and pulled troops away from Rheinberg. When the real crossing happened at Rheinberg, the Allies faced lighter resistance than expected. The Ghost Army's deception had worked flawlessly. The psychological toll on these men was significant. They were constantly aware that if the enemy figured out what they really were, they'd be massacred. They carried this secret knowledge that they were frauds, pretending to be something they weren't, and that pretense was keeping them alive. Many of them dealt with the stress through art. During downtime between operations, they'd sketch and paint. The Ghost Army produced thousands of artworks during the war, documenting their experiences in a way that photographs couldn't. These paintings and sketches captured the surreal nature of their mission. Images of inflatable tanks sitting next to real trees, soldiers painting camouflage patterns on rubber artillery pieces. The contrast between the fake war they were creating and the real war happening all around them. One of the Ghost Army's most dangerous operations was at the town of Bettembourg in Luxembourg. They were tasked with simulating the 6th Armored Division to cover that division's movement to a different sector. The problem was, Bettembourg was within direct line of sight of German positions on the surrounding hills. The Germans could literally watch them with binoculars. Setting up inflatable tanks in broad daylight, knowing enemy observers were watching, required nerves of steel. The Ghost Army soldiers developed techniques to make the inflation process look natural. They'd set up camouflage netting first, then inflate the tanks under the netting, making it appear as if real tanks were being moved into covered positions. They'd have soldiers climb on the inflatable tanks as if performing maintenance, adding human activity to sell the illusion. They even created fake track marks by dragging chains behind jeeps, leaving tread patterns in the mud that matched real tank treads. Every detail mattered. One mistake, one moment where a German observer saw something that didn't make sense, and the entire operation would collapse. What the official histories don't often talk about is the psychological warfare the Ghost Army waged on themselves. These men were living a lie, and that lie was the only thing keeping them alive. They couldn't tell anyone what they really did. When they met soldiers from real combat units, they had to pretend to be regular troops. When they wrote letters home, they had to be vague about their activities. They carried the weight of knowing that their deceptions were sending German soldiers to the wrong places, causing enemy casualties through misdirection. Some of them struggled with this. They were artists and designers, creative people who'd been trained to build and create, now using their skills to deceive and destroy. The casualty rate for the Ghost Army was remarkably low compared to regular combat units, but they did suffer losses. Men were killed by artillery fire during setup operations. Some died in vehicle accidents during nighttime movements with no headlights. A few were captured during reconnaissance missions, and there was always the fear of what would happen if they were captured. Would the Germans treat them as soldiers or as spies? The Geneva Convention protected uniformed soldiers, but the Ghost Army's mission was fundamentally about deception. They worried that if captured, they might be executed as saboteurs rather than treated as prisoners of war. This fear was never far from their minds. The unit's commander, Colonel Reeder, understood the unique pressures his men faced. He encouraged their artistic pursuits, seeing it as necessary therapy. Between operations, he'd organize informal art shows where the men could display their work. He brought in supplies, paint and canvas and sketchbooks, treating it as essential equipment rather than luxury items. He recognized that these men processed their experiences differently than regular soldiers. They needed to create, to document, to make sense of what they were doing through art. Many of them would go on to become successful artists, designers, and illustrators after the war. Fashion designer Bill Blass served in the Ghost Army. So did photographer Art Kane and sculptor Ellsworth Kelly. They were using their wartime experiences, this bizarre combination of art and warfare, as the foundation for their post-war careers. There were moments of dark humor that helped them cope. They'd give their inflatable tanks nicknames and paint nose art on them, like bomber crews did with their planes. They'd stage elaborate pranks, like the time they set up a fake officers' club complete with inflatable furniture, and invited real soldiers from a nearby unit to a party that didn't exist. They developed an inside joke about being the most dangerous unarmed unit in the army. This gallows humor was essential. It let them acknowledge the absurdity of their situation while still taking the mission seriously. They were clowns in a circus of death, and they knew it, and they laughed about it because the alternative was to break under the pressure. As the war in Europe wound down in early 1945, the Ghost Army faced an uncertain future. They'd proven the concept of tactical deception beyond any doubt. Their operations had saved thousands of Allied lives and contributed to the success of multiple major offensives. But now that victory was approaching, what would happen to them? The military establishment was already thinking about the post-war world. Some officers wanted to disband the unit and classify everything they'd done, making it as if the Ghost Army had never existed. Others argued for preserving the unit and its techniques for future conflicts. The men themselves were just ready to go home. They'd done their job. They'd survived. They wanted to return to their real lives and put the war behind them. But the government had other plans. The Ghost Army's operations were so sensitive, so revealing of Allied deception capabilities, that everything about the unit was immediately classified top secret. The men were ordered never to speak about what they'd done, and for the next 50 years, they didn't. The Ghost Army returned to the United States in July 1945, and then something remarkable happened. They vanished from history. Official military records barely mentioned them. History books about World War II didn't include their story. The men themselves went back to civilian life and kept their secret. They'd signed non-disclosure agreements, and they honored them. For decades, these veterans would attend reunions and social gatherings, and when people asked what they did in the war, they'd give vague answers. "Oh, I was in a special unit in Europe." They couldn't tell their wives the full story. They couldn't tell their children. The Ghost Army became a ghost in the historical record, a classified operation that officially didn't exist. But secrets have a way of coming out. In 1985, a researcher named Rick Beyer stumbled across a brief mention of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in a declassified document. He started digging, tracking down veterans, requesting more documents through the Freedom of Information Act. Slowly, piece by piece, the story emerged. In 1996, the military finally declassified most of the Ghost Army's records. The veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, could finally talk about what they'd done, and when they did, the world was amazed. Here was this incredible story of American ingenuity and courage that had been hidden for 50 years. News organizations picked it up. Documentaries were made. Museums created exhibits featuring the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks and sonic equipment. What's fascinating is how the Ghost Army's techniques influenced modern military doctrine. Everything they pioneered, the integration of visual, audio, and electronic deception, the use of decoys and false radio traffic, the psychological manipulation of enemy intelligence, all of this became standard practice. Today's military calls it information warfare and electronic warfare, but the fundamental concepts were developed by a bunch of art students in 1944. The Ghost Army proved that in modern warfare, perception can be as powerful as firepower, making the enemy see what you want them to see, making them hear what you want them to hear, making them believe what you want them to believe. These are force multipliers that can change the outcome of battles without firing a shot. The story of the Ghost Army reveals something profound about the nature of warfare and human psychology. We think of war as a contest of physical force, armies clashing, weapons destroying, territory being taken or lost. But the Ghost Army won their battles by understanding that war is fundamentally about information and perception. The German commanders weren't defeated by the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks. They were defeated by their own beliefs about what those tanks represented. The Ghost Army weaponized the German military's trust in their own intelligence gathering. They turned the enemy's strength, their methodical reconnaissance and analysis, into a weakness by feeding that system false data. It's a lesson that extends far beyond military strategy. In any competitive environment, controlling the information your opponent receives gives you a decisive advantage. The last surviving members of the Ghost Army are in their late 90s now, and they're still processing what they accomplished. In interviews, many of them express amazement that their crazy scheme actually worked. They were kids, really, early 20s, artists who'd never been in combat, and they were handed this impossible mission and told to figure it out. And they did. They saved lives through creativity. They defeated one of history's most powerful military machines using art and imagination. Their legacy is this profound reminder that there are many forms of courage and many ways to serve. The Ghost Army never fired a shot in anger, but they were warriors nonetheless, fighting with brushes and microphones and inflatable rubber instead of bullets and bombs. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that destroys, it's the one that deceives. And in doing so, they changed warfare forever, showing that the mind is the ultimate battlefield and imagination is the ultimate weapon. That's the real story of the Ghost Army, the artist who defeated Hitler with nothing but illusions, and in the process revealed a truth about human conflict that we're still learning from today.